Imagine living in Florence in 1504. It is the peak of the Renaissance. You have Leonardo da Vinci painting masterpieces that define human perfection, Michelangelo carving statues so realistic you feel bad for their lack of skin. And then there is Giovanni. Giovanni is a man who wanted to be a world-class painter, but he had one minor issue. His hands had the structural integrity of a cooked noodle. While his peers were obsessed with the golden ratio, Giovanni was obsessed with why his squares looked like they were suffering from a severe case of vertigo. In a time where symmetry was the ultimate sign of intelligence, Giovanni was the human equivalent of a glitch in the matrix. He didn't just struggle with lines. He actively offended the very concept of Euclidean geometry. If you asked him to draw a doorway, you'd end up with a shape that looked like an aggressive amoeba trying to escape a burning building. And that, my friends, is exactly where our disaster begins. Giovanni grew up in the shadow of the Duomo, a building so perfectly engineered it makes modern architects weep into their blueprints. His father was a master woodworker, a man who could slice a single hair with a straight-edged chisel. Giovanni, meanwhile, couldn't draw a straight line even if you held a musket to his head. In the 1500s, being an artist wasn't just a hobby. It was a high-stakes competitive sport. You had the guilds, the church, and the wealthy patrons breathing down your neck, demanding perspective and realism. Giovanni spent his childhood trying to imitate the masters, but every time he tried to sketch a pillar, it ended up looking like a swaying tree trunk during an earthquake. He was constantly told by his mentors that he had creative flair, which is medieval code for "please go become a goat farmer. You're ruining our reputation." He felt like a man trying to play a piano with oven mitts on, but he had the heart of a Renaissance visionary and the wrist stability of a drunk toddler. The pressure mounted in his early 20s. He lived in a cramped attic apartment that smelled perpetually of turpentine and despair. His neighbor, a stern apprentice of Michelangelo named Paolo, would wake him up at dawn by loudly measuring things. A perfect vertical, a perfect horizontal. Paolo would shout through the walls, punctuating each syllable with the rhythmic clack-clack of a compass. Giovanni would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to visualize a straight line. He would close his eyes and focus, imagining the sharp, cold, unyielding edge of a ruler. When he opened his eyes and reached for his charcoal, his hand would betray him before the graphite even touched the parchment. It would spasm, twitch, and wiggle, resulting in a line that looked like a seismograph reading for an impending apocalypse. He tried to combat it with heavy weights tied to his wrist, but he only succeeded in pulling the table over and nearly crushing a stray cat. Then came the job that would either make him or break him. Lorenzo de' Medici, a man whose ego was only surpassed by his bank account, decided he needed a portrait for the town square. It wasn't just any portrait, a portrait of the Duke, complete with perfectly straight columns, crisp marble borders, and a grid system that screamed, "I am a wealthy, organized man." The Duke didn't just want a painting. He wanted a testament to his own rigid control over the city. Giovanni, desperate for cash and validation, lied through his teeth. "Oh yes, my lord. Straight lines are my middle name. Giovanni Straight Line Botticelli at your service." He didn't even notice that he'd accidentally invented a new surname, nor did he notice the skeptical eyebrow raise from the Duke's treasurer. He just saw the bag of gold coins the size of a human head and heard the siren song of rent money. He arrived at the workshop the next morning. It was an expansive, echoing space filled with the smell of drying plaster and the oppressive silence of perfectionism. He sat down before the massive canvas, a blank white desert that mocked his very existence. He picked up his charcoal. He took a deep breath, visualizing the path of his hand. Asterisk straight. Just straight. Like an arrow. Like a laser. Like a Roman road. Asterisk his hand began to shake. The line he drew wasn't straight. It took a sharp left turn, did a loop-de-loop, and ended up looking like a lightning bolt that had given up on its dreams. He stared at it in horror. The column looked like a melted candle. The Duke looked like he was standing in a house built by a cartoon ghost. The deadline was tomorrow, and his career was already hanging by a thread, a very wavy, non-linear thread. Panic set in. He didn't just feel the pressure. He felt it sitting on his chest like a fat monk. Giovanni tried everything. He taped 2 rulers together. The result was a line that zigzagged so hard it created a new form of modern art. He tried using a string dipped in paint, but the string snapped and sprayed ink across the room like a squid having an existential crisis. He even tried holding his breath until he passed out, thinking that if he was unconscious, his hand would move perfectly. He woke up with a charcoal stick stuck in his nose and the canvas covered in a dark, murky smudge that looked vaguely like the Duke's left ear. He tried to frame it as Impressionism 300 years before it was invented, but the Medici guards just looked at him with profound confusion. He was running out of supplies, running out of time, and his sanity was currently filing for divorce. The chaos reached a boiling point when he tried to use a wooden plank as a guide, only for the plank to slide, hit the wall, knock over a bucket of oil, and cause a small fire that Giovanni had to beat out with his only remaining brush. The brush was now a charred, mangled clump of hog hair, and the studio floor was a disaster zone of oily footprints and frantic charcoal scribbles. He sat in the middle of the mess, sobbing quietly. He had promised the Duke geometry, but he had provided a fever dream. He decided he would leave Florence under the cover of night, perhaps find a village where the people were so nearsighted they wouldn't notice the wavy pillars, or maybe become a professional knot-tier for fishing nets. Just as he was preparing to flee to the countryside to live as a hermit, disaster struck the studio. A massive earthquake, a rare and violent tremor that shook the very foundations of Florence, rocked the city. The floor buckled. The walls groaned like an old man getting out of a chair. Giovanni's easel wobbled, tipped over, and the canvas slid face-first into a pile of wet, spilled mortar and construction sand that had been sitting near the worksite. When the dust settled, Giovanni peeled the canvas off the floor. The wet mortar had pressed into the canvas, creating a series of bizarre, warped, yet strangely symmetrical geometric patterns. It looked like a map of the stars or a fancy Italian rug. It wasn't straight. In fact, it was the most distorted, wavy, warped thing anyone had ever seen. But because of the way the mortar dried, it had an odd, trippy, 3D effect. It was avant-garde. It was bizarre. He looked at the canvas. It wasn't the Duke. It wasn't a building. It was a rhythmic, flowing cascade of curves that seemed to move when you looked at them from the corner of your eye. It was exactly what the Duke didn't ask for, but exactly what a man who had already seen every boring, straight-line portrait in Italy would want. It was the liquid architecture of a man who had stopped trying to fight the wobble and had instead decided to embrace the wave. Giovanni presented the masterpiece. Lorenzo the Medici entered the studio, his entourage trailing behind him like a velvet-clad storm cloud. He walked toward the canvas, his expression stern and ready to demand a refund. He stopped. He squinted at it, walked around it twice, and then gasped. It's not straight," the Duke whispered. The room went dead silent. Giovanni's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. "It's like staring into the soul of a liquid." The Duke's eyes went wide. "It's like the architecture is breathing. It's revolutionary." Giovanni didn't correct him. He just nodded solemnly, as if this had been his plan all along. He took a deep, shaky breath and leaned in, pointing at a particularly squiggly line. "My lord, the straight line is a myth of the mind," Giovanni said, channeling a level of pretension he didn't know he possessed. "True nature is motion. True nature is the curve." The Duke was so impressed by this pseudo-philosophical nonsense that he wept. He threw a bag of gold at Giovanni and declared him the court's newest visionary. He became the most celebrated artist in the city, known for his liquid Renaissance style. He made a fortune, lived in a mansion, and never had to draw a straight line again. He was commissioned by bishops, merchants, and even the Pope, who insisted that Giovanni's warped perspective offered a divine view of heaven's own turbulence. He spent his days in luxury, drinking fine wine and laughing as students tried to replicate his technique by purposefully shaking their hands. He even took an apprentice, a young boy named Marco who was actually quite good at drawing straight lines. Every time Marco tried to draw a perfect square, Giovanni would gently nudge his elbow, causing the line to jitter. "No, no, child," he would whisper. "Let the spirit of the noodle guide you." The moral of the story? If you're bad at something, just wait for a natural disaster to make it look like a highbrow artistic choice. History is written by the winners, but it's drawn by the people who accidentally dropped their art in the mud. And really, Who needs straight lines when you can have a chaotic masterpiece that makes everyone question their sanity? Giovanni eventually passed away in his sleep, clutching a crooked stick of charcoal, leaving behind a legacy of fluid, beautiful, and delightfully wonky art. He was remembered as the man who broke the mold, quite literally, by being unable to follow it. So, the next time you feel like your life is a series of crooked lines and failed attempts at perfection, don't worry. Keep wobbling, my friends. It might just make you a genius. Because in a world of boring, rigid lines, it is the curves that make the view worth seeing.